Welcome back, everyone. I'm Joy Reid in for Melissa. On Friday morning, a state of emergency was lifted in Ferguson, Missouri, placing the city back under local control for the first time in 5 days. St. Louis County initially imposed the state of emergency after a young man allegedly opened fire on a group of undercover police officers Sunday night. The officers fired back, leaving the 18-year-old, whose name is Tyrone Harris Jr., in critical condition. Although police say Harris was not part of the protest, the freshly imposed state of emergency came amid the renewed demonstrations marking the one-year anniversary of the shooting death of 18-year-old Michael Brown. The killing of a black teenager by a police officer, the outrage expressed on social media, the subsequent protests, and a militaristic police response brought national attention to the small city of Ferguson and added fuel to the movement known as Black Lives Matter. This week, as protesters marked the one-year anniversary of Brown's death, it felt like deja vu. Protests and vigils were mostly peaceful, beginning Sunday morning with a silent march. But after dark, police moved in wearing riot gear, following reports of looting and vandalism at some downtown businesses. Then on Monday, more than 100 people were arrested for various acts of civil disobedience. More than 50 were arrested while protesting at the federal courthouse in St. Louis. More than 60 were arrested when they blocked Interstate 70 during rush hour, clasping hands across the busy road. When one woman tried to drive her SUV through the crowd, 2 protesters fought back, and they were charged with assault and felony property damage. But the rest of the week was peaceful, and yesterday, after several nights of quiet, the county executive lifted the state of emergency, saying, quote, "I am pleased to report our law enforcement officers have established order while preventing further acts of violence in Ferguson." Some of the most striking images from Ferguson this week were these: heavily armed white men who appeared at the protests saying they were members of the Oath Keepers, a paramilitary group that advocates armed resistance to what they deem unlawful government overreach. The fact that police didn't approach the armed Oath Keepers or ask them to leave, let alone arrest them, while unarmed black protesters were handcuffed and arrested, touched a nerve.
You and people who look like you, white males, have the sovereignty to take advantage of the Second Amendment and walk around with assault rifles. But we can't even stand out here and assemble peacefully and exercise our constitutional right to do so without being gassed, maced, and arrested. What's your perspective on that? What do you think about that?
I don't have a perspective.
You don't have a perspective?
I haven't been here since day one, so I don't know. I haven't seen it firsthand how you guys have been treated.
Seeing these images, we have to wonder, has anything changed in Ferguson? We also learned this week that the city is pursuing criminal charges against members of the media who were arrested during last year's protests, arrests that have been condemned by journalists and human rights groups as unjustified and unconstitutional. At the table with me here in New York are Cornell William Brooks, President and CEO of the NAACP, Julieta Garibay, Campaigns Director for United We Dream, Akil Reed Amar, Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University, and Jean Theo Harris, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College. And joining us now live from Washington, D.C. is one of those journalists now facing charges in Ferguson, Wesley Lowery of the Washington Post. Okay, Wesley, you were reporting in Ferguson this week. First of all, let me ask you if you feel like anything has really changed much in Ferguson versus last August.
You know, in terms of my reporting, it seems as if much has not changed in Ferguson. And so, I mean, there are the obvious things people point out, right? The national changes, the change in perception, the change in perspective, the now national conversation we're having about body cameras. Some states we're seeing, even California just this last week, banned the use of grand juries in cases of police shootings. New York, which is now using a special prosecutor in cases of police shootings. But in Ferguson, Missouri itself, we've seen some cosmetic change, but not a lot of deep political and policy change. So we've seen a new police chief who's a black officer. We've seen some new city council members be elected, some turnover in the court system. But with that said, in terms of the broader policies, we're still seeing a lot of people being arrested, a lot of arrest warrants being issued, and we are also still seeing in Ferguson, Missouri, a disconnect between a lot of the police departments and the residents themselves, and that manifested itself in the arrests that we still saw during these acts of civil disobedience and these demonstrations in business in this last week.
Yeah, and they certainly seem to be just as aggressive against the protesters. I want to ask you about your own arrest, yourself and Ryan J. Riley of the Huffington Post, or facing prosecution. Do you expect these prosecutions to go forward? Is that the expectation of your legal counsel?
Well, at this point, we've been charged, and so we're moving forward as if we're expecting this to go forward, unless we hear otherwise. You know, and we've come out and we've been pretty forthcoming with what we think of these charges previously. You know, and so I don't have a ton of new stuff to add, but essentially, you know, we know that we were detained illegally. We were given illegal instructions, and we were two journalists trying to do our jobs. And I think that I was frankly surprised that these charges were something that were revisited by St. Louis County a year later. But at this point, we probably should have learned a lesson about being surprised by the behavior of the police in Ferguson, Missouri.
Yeah, absolutely. And Akil, I want to come to you on that question, because this idea of arresting journalists who were on the street actually covering the protest, but then really, despite the negative blowback from having done that, really going after and continuing to pursue prosecution of these journalists. What do you make of that as a constitutional matter, as a legal matter?
So we've been talking about the First Amendment and freedom of assembly and freedom of the press, and the Second Amendment has come in with folks parading around. Let me give you a different account of the Second Amendment, and it starts with power and voting power. Black people are now voting in Ferguson more than they were before, and we have city council people, okay? And I said we need to have juries look different and grand juries look different. We need to have, and city councils look different, police departments as well, and not just the chief, but the department should look like the community, just like the jury should look like the community. And Bernie Sanders' platform talked a little bit about representative police forces. The Second Amendment is actually about that. Let me read it to you, and now listen to it with fresh ears. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The militia is supposed to look like the people. Who are the people? The voters. We, the people, actually on election day. We elect Congress. Who's the militia? Well, today, at the federal level, it's basically the Army. The Army should look like America. And at the local level, basically, it's police departments today. We don't really have the founders' militia anymore. We have police departments at the local level, the Army at the national level, and both should look like the community, as should grand juries, as should petit juries, as should city councils, as should people who show up on election day.
But I'm also just concerned specifically for the panel about this idea of essentially punishing journalists for being there and filming. I mean, that as a constitutional matter seems dubious, Cornell.
Yes, of course it is, but the climate in Ferguson has not changed. So across the country, we've seen a kind of seismic shift in attitudes with respect to race, but in terms of policy reforms, a glacial shift. So across the country, and specifically in Missouri, all we've seen is a change with respect to municipal fines. The law under which Michael Brown was killed has not been changed. There has not been reform in policing across the state, and the governor and legislature would both admit that they are not where they should be. So the point being here is we can't be surprised that journalists are treated as poorly as the citizens.
Right. And Wesley, I want to come back in on this question of the changes that have been happening in personnel and who's actually running things in Ferguson are real. There are more city council members. They have a new police chief. But when you were back in Ferguson and just looking at the situation on the ground, do you get the sense that people feel more empowered, the citizens who live there?
No. I mean, talking to citizens and residents on the ground, Ferguson feels as divided as ever. The business owners and some of the parts of the white community who were very frustrated with these protests and these demonstrations a year ago remain frustrated and remain confounded and confused by this anger they're seeing by their fellow residents. And many of the people who take to the streets are just as angry and just as upset, and they do not feel in any way more empowered. And so as I had conversations, as I worked the city for several days last weekend, it became very clear that, like I said, there's certainly been some cosmetic change in Ferguson, Missouri, and there's been some cosmetic change in greater St. Louis, and you know, with the caveat that sometimes it is hard to feel the Titanic turning as it turns. There are certainly some work that is being done. There are people who are working hard and some progress that has been made. But no, to show up in Ferguson last week, it was not to parachute into a new and a fundamentally different and changed city than a year ago that had we dropped in a year prior.
Yeah, we don't have a great deal of time, but I have to play this one piece of sound, one more, because Akil did talk about the Second Amendment. Let's play the Oath Keeper again, interacting with, this time, a white protester who's asking them about what they were doing.
Can you imagine a black man coming down here looking like you, walking this way? Do you think what would happen to him? What do you think might happen here? You wouldn't be left alone like you are.
I mean, Gene, you have this situation where literally you have white armed men walking around the street unassailed by police and black unarmed protesters being arrested. This seems dystopic.
Undoubtedly, right? And I think this is emblematic of where we are in this country, that some people's rights are understood to be full and rich, and some people's rights, right? We cannot imagine an African American fully armed like that, a Muslim American fully armed like that, and getting to walk freely. Similarly, right, that when you are stopped by police, the kind of generosity, the idea that the police are protecting and serving you varies, right? Sandra Bland, how she's treated, right, versus sort of if you look out on the street, right, the NYPD, it says to protect and serve, and certainly the NYPD protects and serves some people.
Some people, and Julieta, it's clearly the same for members of the Latino community.
Correct, and exactly, I'm talking about Sandra. I remember we were at Netroots, and that's when it was coming out, and I just kept on thinking, had Sandra been a white woman or an Irish immigrant, she would have never been pulled over, or maybe pulled over, but she would have never even asked to turn off your cigarette.
Absolutely.
She would have never died.
Well, I think it's important to note that the traffic stop before that went swimmingly, and the person apparently didn't have their insurance, and the police officer said, have your dad email it to you. All right, well, I want to thank Wesley Lowry in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much. And everybody stay right there, because up next, why did police collect DNA samples from some of the Ferguson activists? One of the protesters joins us live when we come back.